If you've ever even briefly considered switching from Apple Home to Home Assistant, then let me tell you the most important things that you need to know and why I actually made that very same move. However, the most important thing I need you to know if you are considering this is that you don't need to switch at all. Let me explain. When people started telling me down in the comments how much better Home Assistant is and how much happier I would be if I switched over to it, I don't think anyone told me this crucial piece of information. You can run both together. See, when I very first considered moving over, I started thinking of all of these reasons why I couldn't possibly switch. I was too invested in the Apple ecosystem, I couldn't give up using Siri on my HomePods, for example, and my wife would just absolutely hate switching away from the Apple Home app, which she had just about gotten used to. But the reality is I still run all of my HomePods to this day, and my wife still uses the Apple Home app absolutely fine because of the HomeKit bridge integration in Home Assistant. What it does is it allows you to create virtual bridges for your devices, which you then scan back into Apple Home again to re-expose all of your devices. You know, like when a manufacturer makes you buy one of their physical bridges to pair their products to, and then you scan that into the Apple Home app and boom, all the paired child devices appear. What's particularly great about this is the fact that I can also bridge non-HomeKit compatible devices into Apple Home as well. So this basically replaces HomeBridge entirely if you've ever gone down that rabbit hole. An important tip which I'll quickly share here while I'm talking about this is there is a 150 device limit which Apple imposes on bridges for the number of devices that they can expose to Apple Home. So it's worth thinking about exposing each set of devices as their own bridge here, like one for lights and another one for switches, etc. So you don't do what I did and end up having to segregate them into separate bridges later and move them all into the right rooms in Apple Home once again. But once you've done that, and granted it can be a lot of work if you've already got loads of devices, you will be back to where you began in the Apple Home app. You can still control everything as you did before via Siri on any of your Apple devices, but you can also control them all through Home Assistant too, and begin making way more, way smarter automations. Yes, that's right, I said more because Apple Home has a limit of around 200 or so automations, which I know because I hit it. And that is ultimately what forced me to take the plunge into Home Assistant. And it's the best thing that's happened in my smart home journey. And really that is why I'm making this video, because I held off on adding Home Assistant into my mix for so long that it became this mammoth task to integrate all of my devices and convert all of my automations that spanned several weeks, and absolute misery for my wife and family while my head was just buried into converting all of my automations over to Home Assistant and learning what I needed to know in order to do so. So my advice to anyone watching this is if you've hit any limitation of Apple Home at any point, it's time for you to get Home Assistant running in the mix. Because the two systems actually work surprisingly well together, Home Assistant can even send announcements to HomePods using text-to-speech, which is something that Apple don't even let you do from an automation in HomeKit directly. I even use Apple Home to get around one or two little weaknesses in the default Home Assistant setup, like location automations. They're notoriously difficult to get working well in Home Assistant, especially without good networking knowledge. So I simply made a toggle helper in Home Assistant for each person in my home and exposed it to Apple Home using the previously mentioned bridges. Then I made automations in the Apple Home app to switch them on and off for each person that comes and goes from my home, giving me a reliable trigger for Home Assistant to run automations when each person arrives or leaves. If you're already into Apple Home, you probably already know that Home Assistant is great for all of the same foundational reasons that you like Apple Home, like working locally wherever possible and holding privacy key at its core. But what you may not have realized is just how well the two work together to create the ultimate smart home setup. If you have any questions about my setup and how I use Apple Home and Home Assistant together, do let me know down in the comments and I'll be sure to answer there and or make a future video on the subject. But for now, remember, home is where the smart is.